So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming here to the next Fair Business workshop. I had in mind another presenter, but he had to excuse himself because he couldn't make it to get here. So I'm going to do this presentation instead of him. Of course, I have another topic, and the topic is corporate fraud. Is it greed, state capture, or a combination of both? To give a little introduction, we are now virtually at the University of Zagreb, Faculty of Electrical Engineering and Computing, that organizes this event together with the Croatian section of the IEEE. My name is Dubravko Sabolić, and I'll be your guest lecturer this time, and I'm going to discuss always interesting topics of corporate fraud, ethics in business administration, large-scale white-collar crime, and potential involvement of the state. I believe these themes are especially important for young students of technology, economics, law, etc., because, believe it or not, many of them will assume the leading positions in corporations or companies they join and become eventually the pillars of society. So, I wonder, do you sometimes have a feeling that the worst nightmare from some Hollywood fiction movie just comes true, as if you were watching it right now on your television set? Now, when we are living in the horror called COVID-19, although it's easing, obviously, it is a good time to remember another one that just started to unfold in front of everyone's eyes almost exactly 19 years ago. Setting the then all-time world record, the Enron Corporation filed for the biggest corporate bankruptcy ever seen. In the year before, the reported revenues were about 101 billion United States dollars, yet the world record didn't last that long. Only a year later, it was beaten quite narrowly, though, by another American corporation called WorldCom. It was a starting gun for a huge economic recession called the dot-com bubble. And just as all of us from the rest of the world thought, oh, it's a typical American thing and an endless greed coupled with emerging innovative industries, the Parmalat scandal broke open. This time it was an Italian multinational corporation in the industry as conservative as and as classical as dairy and food can be. So it was a global phenomenon, and it wasn't just about fancy new technologies and trading schemes and modern industries. Now, almost 2 decades later, what did we learn, if anything? So what is the corporate accounting fraud? What does it mean? It is, in the first place, not necessarily connected with the classical crimes such as embezzlement or money laundering or anything like that. It is all about cooking the books, but why would anyone like to cook the books? Because making public companies look nicer helps keeping or increasing their stock value, basically. And if the manager's remuneration programs are closely tied to the company's stock price, then you have a clear incentive to behave unethically. For example, take stock options awarded to highly ranked corporate managers. At a certain future day of maturity, you will be able to buy a certain number of stocks at a price that was fixed when you were awarded the stock options. So if the stock goes up, you can make money by exercising your stock options and then instantly selling at marketplace, or decide to keep them further if you're betting on even higher future increase in price. Note that you have a strong incentive to do anything you can so that you your company's stock price continues rising. So basically, it's all about managers' greed and lack of integrity, at least in the first step. Pumping up the stock value can at first look good for other stakeholders as well. However, it is not in the long run. Because when an accounting fraud is discovered, the stock price plummets in most cases down to zero. But by that time, as you will see from this example that I'm going to present now, the managers who engaged in such practices already cashed their stock options and maybe even moved to another country. And you who put your hard-earned savings into the company stocks are left with nothing. So basically your money was pumped from your pocket to theirs. But they didn't, again, threat you with any guns or violence of any kind. So they counted probably on your own greed and lack of information or knowledge. Being said so, is it even legal? Why should it be forbidden to smart out the others? In corporate fraud schemes, the top managers of a corporation seek ways to manipulate the rules of the game and artificially pump up the stock value. That way, they have a direct vested interest in engaging in book cooking instead of real business. Enron's top executives, as you will see, cashed in about United States dollars 1.3 billion, while all other stockholders, as well as many pensioners, were left without anything at all after the game finished. It was not possible to happen on lower levels of the organization unless controlled and directed by top managers. The external auditors must have at least looked aside with eyes half closed. And the Enron scandal raised, among other things, the question of trust in the guardians of the system, that is, the auditors. So the United States courts drove for example, the big Arthur Andersen Corporation out of business because they were those who helped cover all the scandals that were going on within Enron. So can it be forbidden to be the smartest guy in the room or in your environment? It cannot if everyone were in the same playing field and at the same level. However, financial fraud is all about concealing information from those you want to rip off. Thus, although it is carried out with alternative means instead of violence, it is really nothing more than a grand-scale robbery. We routinely use a jargon term for it, the white-collar crime, because it is done by guys and sometimes girls with, sharply dressed with nice clothes. In Enron case, we can see everything that is essentially important to appreciate the sheer complexity of accounting fraud schemes and somewhat smaller complexity of their criminal intent, of course. So can the grand-scale fraud be done by just a bunch of crooked and immoral managers? Well, the truth is that any criminal scheme can be started without much external help. However, huge fraudulent schemes cannot be perpetuated without a much wider conspiracy. For example, banks that lend you money may not have had criminal intentions in the beginning. Yet when they realize how deep they are already in it with you, it can be too late for them to pull out without enormous losses. So they often choose to just keep dancing. Then the states, the governments, can adopt occasionally inadequate legislation, bad legislation. Again, they may not have had necessarily criminal or bad intentions in the beginning, but you see the pattern. The state capture as a notion is a very legitimate question to ask. Can it be possible or even imaginable that state elites sometimes intentionally produce bad laws to avoid de facto monopoly rights to certain favorite corporations? Can it be a permanent state, not depending on changes of government officials due to elections? And are there corporations big enough to bribe just everyone who comes to power and has a possibility to make political decisions? And of course, how can something as dull as accounting be employed so creatively in big-time crime? I mean, this is perhaps my personal opinion, but is there really a more boring occupation than being an accountant? Probably there is, but I'm not aware of one. But don't kill me for that if there are accountants here watching and listening. So what's the catch? How could accountants have become masterminds of the biggest fraudulent schemes mankind have ever seen in the history? These are some very important general questions for any society, let alone vulnerable societies such as, for example, East European post-communist nations, our own here in Croatia being one of them. Now, keeping in mind these bigger questions, I'd like to return us now to our more limited topic for today, and this is the financial fraud and the famous case of the demise of Enron that crashed in the biggest bankruptcy until that day in late 2001. But first, for our students, for our younger students, I'd like to recall some basic principles of accounting. Say you start a new company for producing just anything. You obviously must put up some cash to buy assets you will work with to produce your goods or services. For instance, you must buy a building, some machinery, transport vehicles, and all kinds of other stuff to make, for example, a shoe factory. The cash can come basically from two different types of sources. The first one is equity, that is the money from your own pocket as an owner of the business, the founder of it. And the other is liability, that is the money you lend from a bank or another provider. And at the end of this little genesis of your new company, the booked value of all assets your newborn company operates matches exactly the cash raised from these two types of sources. A systematic listing of all items of assets, equity and liabilities is called the balance sheet. I have it on a picture here. Here you can see a typical balance sheet in a short form, of course. At the left side, which is called assets, you have just a listing of asset items, be it from every individual piece of equipment of asset of any kind is listed here. At the right side are the sources of financing for obtaining those assets. And there are two kinds of sources: liabilities, that is your debts toward banks or other lenders, and your equity, if there are many co-owners or more co-owners, more than just one, and there always can be, like you, your mom, your dad, your partners, your friends, anybody, each of you has a certain portion of the total equity. So it is the listing of your individual shares. In the balance sheet on the asset side, the cash money is also an item. There are also some other items of assets that can easily be converted to money in a very short time. Such ones, together with money, form a bulk of liquid assets called working capital. However, there also may be some liability items that you will have to pay off very soon, say in a year or sooner. When you subtract them from the working capital, you get the net working capital, which is actually the bloodstream of resources immediately ready for paying your current or immediate operating expenses. And this is very important for any company to have liquid capital so that they can pay for their immediate expenses. For example, if you operate a gas power plant, you have to purchase gas to produce electricity. But if you don't pay for gas to your supplier, then it would stop supplying you very quickly, and you'll be out of business. So the cash is cash and similar pieces of assets are quite important for any company. But how does money come into a company except from owners and lenders? Well, the best way for the money to come is by selling the products and services you produce. By accruing profits from the company's financial assets this is another way of getting the money. So if your company buys, for example, stock of another company, then the dividends they pay at the end of the year will be your cash income. Only the money generated by doing business is what really counts in any company, because as you can imagine, bank loans must be paid back with interest, even with interest. So you have to pay them back. You cannot avoid that. And regarding the equity, you already gave the money to the company when you provided the equity capital. So it actually left your pocket for a while, or perhaps even for good if your company is not doing well. How the assets are valued in, I call it normal accounting. Take an example. Say that the company had enough available cash and that it used it to purchase a machine for shoemaking for, say, 100,000 euros. To do that, obviously no new equity from the owners is needed, and no new loans from the banks is needed either. Thus, the only way for the balance sheet to remain balanced is to enter the machine value into the books exactly as 100,000 euros of value. That is, the total asset value remained the same, only the structure of it was partially changed by converting 100,000 euros of money, which is a liquid asset, into a 100,000 euros of long-term asset called shoemaking machine. What happens in later years, as obviously the machine will deteriorate in time and eventually have to be disposed? Well, each year you will deduct, that is, write off a certain percentage, say 10% of the initial value of the initial 100,000 euros. These 10% are called amortization. As it obviously is an expense because you decrease the total value of assets, you should have put it into the calculation of your product's price. So if everything is okay with your business, this rate of amortization will be coming back to the assets part of the balance sheet in the form of cash money gathered from buyers of your products, of your shoes. Thus, you'll get the cash fully back in the course of 10 years in this example. But hopefully, you'll get even more money than just amortization plus other expenses, and it'll be your profit at the end of the day. Now, let's be precise. What is the profit at all? If in a given period the total value of company's assets grows more than the total increase in new loans plus newly injected equity, we are talking about the profit. So that's what company itself made, and what was not put forward by either banks or lenders or you as co-owners. And clearly the profit is a consequence of conducting a successful business. If the company sold their products for more money than just the sum of all the costs, including amortization, it earned profit. It's simple as that. Yet, if the change in total asset value was smaller than the sum of new loans and equity, then the company made a loss. So you can have a loss as well. It depends on how successful your business is. Profit and loss, both of them, whichever happens, accrue to the owners. So at the end of the year, your equity can either increase or decrease. But let us ask ourselves what value to book into our books when we buy another company, which is not a nice, neat piece of equipment or asset like a car or a truck or a machine, and which doesn't necessarily have a known market price at the time of purchase. So as you can imagine, this is a bit of a tricky question. Well, you can always try to calculate the net worth of the target company by deducting the total liabilities from the total assets. That way you'll find out what's the book value free of the burden of debt. But is it a fair market value of that company? Well, some companies have stocks listed on a stock exchange. If there is sufficient and lasting liquidity in the market for that individual stock, which you can easily find out, and if there is no market manipulation, which you often cannot find out, at least easily, the stock price can be a good orientation on the marginal market value of the company at that time. Some companies, on the other hand, are not listed anywhere. Yet their fair market value may as well not be equal to the book value at all, because perhaps that company has a strong brand or which would give you rational expectations on future good profits, or it owns some important and maybe recently obtained intangible goods and rights such as patents, building permits, concession for natural resources, etc. So one way or the other, you will end up with assessing the fair value in some way. You'll have to do it. In most cases, it will differ from the book value. Say you eventually acquire your target company and continue using its assets like buildings, halls, machinery, etc. Suppose for simplicity that you enter these tangible goods at their booked value as they were before the acquisition. You also book the accompanying values of liabilities. To repeat, the difference between the two is just the net book value of the acquired company. But say that you paid for it more than that. How would you, more than this net book value? I mean, how would you treat this in your financial statements, in your books? Well, that more value is called usually goodwill. This is the excess money you paid for the fair value of the business above the mere net value of assets. But what is the fair value? Of course, it is a subject to assessment, to an assessment, to evaluation, which doesn't have to be always perfectly done. So how good is the goodwill as a measure of value of a company? Now let us recall what we learned, I'm now talking to our students, what we learned previously in this semester about assessing the net present value of any business or any project, if you like. In these assessments, you will always use at least the following parameters For example, the expected sales of products over a long period in the future. The expected market prices you will be able to charge over a long period of the future. The expected operating and capital expenses over the same period. Then the expected cost of capital over the same long period, etc. Note that all of those parameters are expected values and by far not guaranteed. So the assessment always assumes existence of risks and uncertainties about the values you get. And even if you had the most honest intentions, those assessments can turn out to be wrong in the real world, and they often do. Note also that one can pretty easily manipulate the results of such investment studies by filling in expected values of parameters that would justify whatever the goal you might have with your investment study. So what happens if you miss the fair value a lot? After you acquired a company, say that you learned over time that the deal was not that good after all. Perhaps the patent for a new technology was a bogus, and you didn't know that then. Perhaps the brand was overridden by a new competitor with a killer new product line. Well, it can happen, and in that case, unfortunately, you will have to write off the goodwill in its entirety or partially. A goodwill is, of course, recall, it is an item in your balance sheet at the asset side. As you cannot at the same time write off any liabilities because you still have to pay back all the credits you raised, this will immediately occur as a loss, that is a negative component of profit in your profit and loss statement. However, it will usually be perceived as worse or much worse than a normal business loss because the so-called normal business loss, because the big write-offs indicate bad strategic managerial mistakes or even accounting malpractices, so that the trust in the company and its leadership deteriorates. To make accounting system as explicit and as indicative and as comparable as possible, there are some general principles of accounting which are called generally accepted accounting principles, and they are sort of international industry standard that develops over time and that also has to comply with state requirements, with regulatory requirements, etc. But it is important to know that each company, especially the companies listed in public exchanges, stock exchanges, must obligatorily follow certain rules of accounting. And they are all to be found in the generally accepted accounting principles and corresponding documents, which I'm not going to go into any details now. Now, let me mention a notion of so-called mark-to-market accounting practice, in contrast to historical cost accounting, which I just briefly explained. Historical cost is about booking the cost of purchase of assets and depreciating them over time. Mark-to-market is another thing, and it can help companies that usually deal with assets that have volatile market values, prices, and so on. Mark-to-market or fair value accounting refers to accounting for the fair value of an asset or liability based on the current market price or the price for similar assets and liabilities, or based on another objectively assessed fair value by some model, in which case we talk about mark-to-model accounting. Fair value accounting has been a part of generally accepted accounting principles in the United States, for example, since the early 90s, since the big deregulation of financial sector, and is now regarded as sort of a gold standard in some circles, at least. But its criminally wrongful use that I will try to explain to you is considered to be one of the reasons for the Enron scandal and the eventual bankruptcy of the company, as well as the closure of the large accounting firm called Arthur Andersen, then one of the big five in the world, the biggest five of the world. Mark-to-market accounting can change values on the balance sheet as market conditions change. In contrast, historic cost accounting, based on the past transactions, is simpler, much more stable, and easier to perform, but does not represent current market value, not necessarily. It merely summarizes past transactions instead. Mark-to-market accounting can become volatile if market prices fluctuate greatly or change unpredictably and very fast. Buyers and sellers then may claim a number of specific instances when this is the case, including inability to value the future income and expenses correctly. Therefore, it can be harder to implement and to audit, and it can cause harder legal consequences later on in disputes with other companies or stakeholders. So is mark-to-market accounting, which was adopted by Enron managers, guilty for corporate scandals that occurred in that company or any other? Of course, it is not. The very idea of mark-to-market accounting system seems, well, at least useful and appealing, because the historic cost in many cases cannot give you the realistic picture of the true market value of a company. Yet, given many ambiguities in these constantly rolling re-evaluations of assets, there's a lot of room for manipulation, and that is what the Enron managers had been doing. For more factual information on the Enron scandal and the surrounding political and economic conditions of that time in that country, that is United States of America, I can recommend you to watch the following movie. You can watch it freely at Vimeo at this address. It is called Enron, the Smartest Guys in the Room. It is almost 2 hours long video, and you can find it easily by a generic search on the internet or on that address, which I can send you eventually. Now I realize that I don't have it on the screen, but nevertheless. How the things began for Enron Corporation? Let us start the story from the beginning. It began in 1985 after the merger of Houston Natural Gas to Internorth. Those are the two natural gas pipeline companies that had about 64,000 kilometers of pipelines transporting the gas between producers and utilities in certain parts of the United States of America. The CEO of Houston Natural Gas was then Kenneth Lay, who became the CEO of the merged company that was a bit later named Enron. So then it was a classical infrastructure business with as conservative accounting practices as you can imagine. There's a little funny story of the name Enron, which I want to share with you. Just to introduce a little kind of distraction from the main line of the topic. At first, After Internorth acquired its smaller competitor Houston Natural Gas, the new company was briefly called HNG Internorth. So they just compiled the two names. Very soon, probably after they paid some consultant to create the new brand name, the company was named Enteron. The idea was probably that it would represent a corporation with a new vigor entering the new markets emerging in the dawn of deregulation of the gas industry, which was going on then. However, somebody warned the management that in Latin language, the word enteron means literally small intestine, which didn't seem very appropriate for a company operating gas pipes, right? So they just shortened the name to Enron. And well, you have to admit, this name is really good, and the logo designed by Paul Rand is even better. I can find it. Now you can see the logo. It's really nice. And it wasn't paid that much. So this was the funny story of the name. The first name of the big company was small intestine. Okay. But they realized very soon that it's not very good, so they abandoned it and shortened it to Enron. So in the beginning, in the early 80s, most contracts between then natural gas producers and pipelines were take-or-pay contracts, where pipelines agreed either to purchase a predetermined quantity at a given price or be liable to pay the equivalent amount in case of failure to honor the contract. In these contracts, prices were typically fixed over the contract life or increased with inflation, but the contract lives were at least in years, sometimes in a decade or two. Pipelines, in turn, on the other side, had similar long-term contracts with local gas distribution companies or electric utilities to purchase the gas from them. So these contracts assured long-term stability in supply and prices of natural gas. And it was a very sort of calm market. But then deregulation came. Changes in the regulatory rules for the natural gas market during the mid-80s, which deregulated prices and permitted for more flexible arrangements between producers and pipelines, led to an increased use of spot market transactions. And you had a formation of sort of exchanges for the gas, for contracts for supplying the gas. By 90s, 75% of gas sales were transacted at spot prices, at spot markets, at exchanges, rather than through long-term contracts. Enron, which owned the largest interstate network of pipelines, profited from the increased gas supply and flexibility resulting from the regulatory changes. So they sort of liked it. Its returns on beginning equity in the years 1987 to 1990, when it was primarily a pipeline business, were like 14, 13 or 16%, compared with an estimated equity cost of capital of around 13%. So they had a good employment of their capital. They made a good deal of money as a result of deregulation. In an attempt to achieve even further growth, Enron pursued a diversification strategy, which is very common for big companies. It began by reaching beyond its pipeline business to become involved in natural gas trading. So they continued, of course, the pipeline infrastructure business by providing pipeline services of transport, but they also engaged in trading. Trading is a totally different type of business. It has really nothing to do with the gas itself, nor with pipelines. It's just reselling the contracts. So a trader is just like a trader for anything, is just a middleman that buys cheap and tries to sell at more expensive price. This extended the natural gas model to become a financial trader and market maker later in electricity, power, coal, steel, paper and pulp, water, broadband, fiber optic cable capacity, etc. So Enron in time entered many different industries, and it really became a conglomerate of companies that had been doing all kinds of stuff. It undertook international projects also involving construction and management of energy facilities in foreign and overseas countries. By 2001, Enron had become a conglomerate that owned and operated gas pipelines, electricity plants, pulp and paper plants, and so on, which I already listed, and traded extensively in financial markets for the same products and services. So in summary, from the start of the 90s until the year end of 1998, Enron stock rose by 300 or so %, which was only modestly higher than the rate of growth in the Standard & Poor's 500 index. But then their stock exploded after the end of 1998. It exploded. It increased by 56% in 1999 only, and a further 87% in 2000, compared to a 20% increase and a 10% decline for the S&P index during the same years. So it sort of took off the market. It was like an airplane leaving the ground and going up to the sky. In the year 2000, Enron was the 7th biggest USA corporation measured by reported revenues. But had it lasted only a year more with the same revenue trends, it would have become the biggest corporation in the world. So that's how fast the growth of that company's stock value was during these years. By the end of 2000, Enron stock was priced at about $83, and its market capitalization exceeded $60 billion, which was 70 times the profits, the annual profits, and 6 times the book value, which was an indication of the stock market's high expectations about its future prospects. So basically it was a big balloon. But no one seemed to notice it, or everyone just played fool. You know, it's hard to tell. Enron was then rated the most innovative large company by Fortune magazine, for example, and within a year, until the end of 2001, its public image, was completely ruined, and its stock price had plummeted to nearly to zero. So the question is, what contributed to this really extraordinary chain of events that was never recorded in known history of mankind? Well, let me explain a bit. Now I found the slide for this video, which I was talking about. So please, if you want to just write down this web address where you can find the movie. It's really a good movie, and it's amusing. It's like a thriller, so you can watch it and learn a lot of stuff, a lot of data about what happened in Enron. Let me explain the mark-to-market, but Enron style, mark-to-market accounting practice. It started with, of course, with a man called Jeffrey Skilling, who was previously a consultant for McKinsey & Company and who worked with Enron during 1987, helping the company create a forward market in natural gas so that they could enter the gas trading. They were sort of creating the platform for trading, the trading place. Skilling so impressed Kenneth Lay in his capacity as a consultant that he was hired by Lay during 90s, and he was hiring to the positions of ultimately of chairman and chief executive officer of Enron Finance Corporation. And very soon he assumed a number of high positions in the complex corporate structure of Enron, to which development he himself contributed a lot, of course. During 1997, he was promoted to president and chief operating officer of Enron, second only to Kenneth Lay himself. So he was the first next to the king, so to say. Skilling began advocating for a switch to mark-to-market accounting from his first days in Enron, because he realized certain good things that these kind of accounting practices could have brought to the company, or at least they were in line with the ideas he came with into that company. In November 1991, Skilling filed the new accounting system, the proposition to the SEC, to the American Financial Regulator, Security and Exchange Commission, for the approval. And it was approved relatively quickly in January 1992. Enron actually did not use mark-to-market accounting, but they used mark-to-model accounting for contracts that lack a readily available market price because they are, for example, unique or non-standard. Mark-to-market accounting allowed the company to estimate the present value of each of the contracts by projecting both future costs and benefits, which of course are uncertain at the time the contract is entered or signed. In essence, Enron booked projected profits at the date the contract began, regardless of how these contracts ultimately performed in the future. Of course, if there were liquid markets for assets in question, Enron was supposed to record value consistent with quoted market prices. However, as I just said, Enron was a holder of many totally unique and illiquid contracts, where it had to create models to estimate the fair value. And now we come to the question of the fairness of estimation of the fair value of an asset that Enron bought. So basically, mark-to-model accounting allowed Enron managers to book essentially any amount of profit they desired. And they used it extensively in a non-ethical way. About the first problems that arose in 1987 in an underreported incident, which almost nobody knew before the scandal broke, but which almost killed the company at that early stage, which was noted well before Jeffrey Skilling came into the company. In January 1987, Ken Lay learns that two traders from the Enron oil trading unit in Valhalla, in New York, the people called Borget and Mastriani, set up off-the-books bank accounts to hide certain transactions because they wanted to delay reporting of sudden extra profits they made by trading for Enron by just a quarter of a year. They didn't want to draw attention with a sudden big profit, so they wanted to make it more or less volatile in time by delaying a part of it for a quarter. But it also included 2 million cash transfer to their personal account, which is funny. Ken Lay learned of that. Even more, in October 1987, he learned that the two engaged in trades likely to incur $1 billion of losses for Enron. So they almost gambled away the whole Enron, which would then go bankrupt. One of the Enron's executives was sent there by Ken Lay, and he managed to reposition the trades and thereby reduce losses to only $140 million. Later, that guy testified that Kenneth Lay was warned and he knew everything from the beginning. But he stood up for the two traders as they were then bringing the only real cash to Enron, while other parts of the business were performing rather poorly. After this latest discovery, Lay, of course, played shocked, but he had to fire those two guys. But luckily for Enron, the damage was reduced to an amount which didn't kill it. At that point, Ken Lay probably sort of fell in love with trading as a kind of business, which required almost no tangible assets to have. Thus, the stage for Jeffrey's killing was set, and the moral barriers were definitely broken in that corporation. Now, I'd like to move to another notion called special purpose entities or special purpose vehicles, which is the same. What is it? In most cases, the special purpose entities or vehicles were basically empty shell companies created for sale and lease back the physical assets. There is nothing automatically illegal in them, and they are widely used even today. But there is a set of firm accounting rules, requirements applicable to SP's treatment. Among them, there are 3 criteria that, if all met, enable a sponsor company, in this case Enron, to not consolidate them into own balance sheet. Those 3 criteria are: first, a third-party owner must have a substantive equity stake that is at risk in the special purpose entity, which has been interpreted in the USA practical context as at least 3% of the special purpose entity's total debt and equity. So basically 3 or more % of assets should have been financed independently from a third-party owner. The second condition is the third-party owner must also have a controlling or lion's share or more than 50% financial interest in the special purpose entity. And the third condition is that the third-party owner must be independent from the sponsor company. That is, they must not make decisions on behalf of the sponsor company, but rather in their own name and in their own interest. And as you can imagine, those rules can be slightly played, and Enron did it very extensively. And at the end of the day, most of the special purpose entities formed by Enron did not meet any of those criteria. But in technical terms, for a while, they were believed to be good. Now, in this picture you have on your screens, you can see a simplified model of a typical Enron special purpose vehicle. This picture was taken from San Francisco Chronicle. So what do we have in this picture? First, suppose that Enron creates a new independent special purpose vehicle, which is technically, and I'm deliberately saying technically, independent of Enron. Then an outside bank or banks lend 97% of the cash to that SPV. That loan is guaranteed by Enron's own stock, but behind the curtains. So this guarantee, this collateral was concealed by both Enron and the bank. 3% of the cash comes from an outside investor, in reality an Enron's employee or perhaps another Enron's special purpose vehicle. For that money, the SPV, for that 100% of money, the SPV buys an asset from the Enron, which can be anything from an actual factory to another company's stocks. All in all, the vast majority of that money came from the bank and ended up in Enron. Yet, as Enron can technically keep the SPV out of the balance sheet because this SPV fulfills the three requirements which I spoke about seconds ago or minutes ago. This fact that it is actually a new debt is not disclosed to Enron stakeholders nor the market, because the new debt is not shown in the Enron's balance sheet because it's being kept out of it. So the accounting rules enable that, but it is important to say that it's about the accounting rules that had been played. So that had been implemented in an unethical way. Even more, this new debt actually appears as sales revenue because, as you can see on the picture, Enron actually sold a certain part of assets to the SPV. So it's basically the magic. A new debt, which is something bad, looks to Enron's investors and to the market like a new revenue, which is something good. So instead of looking worse, Enron looks better. And who wouldn't like this? It is a very neat scheme, you must confess. But there are two major underlying problems with it. First, the collaterals provided to the banks by Enron always came as required by the banks with the no loss clause. That is, they were automatically triggered when the stock price of Enron dropped under a predetermined level. So as long as Enron stock price increases, everything is fine, no risk. But aren't all corporate stocks, even the best ones, inherently prone to price swings, to volatility? Of course they are. The other major problem is that the loans given by banks to the SPV still need to be repaid by those SPVs. So can you imagine how it was done? Of course, I'm going to tell you how it was done. Enron created just another layer of SPVs to effectively refinance previous debts. So the new SPVs raised another debt to pay off the previous one. That new debt was obviously, it had to be bigger than the previous because there's some interest to be paid. And so they just raised more loans to pay off the older ones, which is crazy, and it is an self-fulfilling scheme, and it leads very soon it led to an exponential growth in new debt. So basically, it was just a Ponzi scheme, And as any Ponzi scheme, as any pyramidal scheme, it inevitably must have come to an end, because there's not an infinite amount of money in the world. But while it lasted for these several years, it may have been looking glamorous and appealing to always greedy investors in stocks. A great deal of Enron's revenues were in fact new loans raised through SPs or SPVs. So there were not so much money coming from the real business, but rather from the financial activities that were carefully concealed from the eyes of the investors in Enron stocks. Resulting debt was dramatically increasing, although it wasn't visible in the consolidated balance sheet. In time, the number of special purpose entities Enron created was anywhere between 3.5 and 4,000 empty shell companies, designed just to hide true debt of the corporation balance sheet. The schemes with special purpose entities were primarily run by the chief financial officer of Enron, called Andrew Fastow, but with much encouragement from other board members, especially Lay and Skilling. Now, how Enron reached the point of no return when there was no cure to their chronic disease? Off-balance sheet financing techniques are, in fact, as I already said, common in the energy business and other businesses, and can certainly be used in ethical ways if you choose to do it ethically. However, as is clear with the progression of Enron's misuse of special purpose vehicles over time, they became increasingly bold in circumventing ethical practices and accounting rules. In 1993, Enron created an off-balance special purpose entity named the Joint Energy Investment Limited Partnership, or known shortly as JEDI. This was a joint venture with a Californian pension fund called CalPERS. CalPERS, the fund, invested $250 million into the joint venture in cash, while Enron invested $250 million in their own stock. At the time the first JEDI contract was signed, at that time Enron stock was trading at roughly $16 a share, while at the time of its termination 5 years later, it was trading at about $30. In other words, the $250 million posted in Enron stock in JEDI in 1993 was worth about $460 million by 1998. But had Enron stock fallen to, say, $8 instead of rising to 30, the JEDI special purpose entity and perhaps even Enron might have experienced a big crisis in 1998. Because remember, individual stock prices are inherently volatile. That said, the JEDI deal was not necessarily unethical, and it looked pretty much a great deal at that time for both the pension fund CalPERS and Enron, and for the users of the pension fund, because the increase in fund value was great. But it was merely luck that everything went okay during those 5 years, and then that the Enron stock have risen. But the JEDI 2 deal became the landmark case for Enron, because it became a role model for the most of its subsequent abuses of the accounting practices and special purpose vehicles. When Enron wanted to engage in a second JEDI deal with Kolpers in 1998. The Kolpers was willing to engage only if it got out of the previous one. And Enron didn't know that before. So Kolpers' $250 million stake in JEDI 1 was then valued at 383 because the fund value was risen, obviously. And to buy Kolpers out, Enron had to come up with new $383 million to buy it out. So Andrew Fastow formed yet another special purpose vehicle that they called CHUCO. They used to give funny names to those companies. It is best to think of the CHUCO deal as two separate transactions, one for temporary financing of the purchase of Kolpers' stake, and the other for permanent financing afterwards. In the temporary financing deal, CHUCO borrowed $383 million from two banks and bought out Kolpers' interest in JEDI. So far, so good. However, in order for these two banks to underwrite the loans to CHUCO, they first required Enron to guarantee the loans, which Enron did with their stock, obviously. Because CHUCO gained approval from Enron's auditors, Arthur Andersen, the debt was kept off Enron's balance sheet as a special purpose vehicle. So it was the second layer special purpose vehicle compared to JEDI. For Enron, the debt was merely a guarantee. It wasn't a debt in their balance sheet, but a guarantee. But as it comes to permanent financing of CHUCO, the things become even more interesting. As each special purpose entity was required to have a general and limited partner, Andrew Fastow simply created another layer of SPEs to act as the general limited partners. Rather than solving a business problem, Fastow was solving all the time a disclosure problem. So his main task in the corporation was to hide the information from the capital market, from financial market, from the regulators, from stock investors, and so on and so on. The general partner and the limited partner in CHUCO were special purpose vehicles also created by Enron called Big River and Little River, again, funny names. So those two companies each borrowed $11.5 million from Barclays Bank for a combined credit of $23 million. The documents governing these loans to Big River and Little River closely resemble loan agreements. Nevertheless, they were labeled certificates and funding agreements rather than simply being called loans. In fact, instead of requiring Big River and Little River to pay interest to Barclays, the Big River and Little River special purpose entities were required to pay yield at a specified percentage rate, which was just a deceptive name for what was simply a bank loan. Somebody turned on the mic, so if you want to pose a question, please do, or please turn it off because it produces a lot of noise. Okay, thanks. You did it. So the documentation was intentionally made ambiguous, which allowed Barclays to characterize the transactions as loans for its business and regulatory purposes, while at the same time allowing Enron and CHUCO to simultaneously characterize them as equity contributions. In essence, the CHUCO deal was kind of like a deal made by a person, a citizen, who takes out a mortgage to buy a house, but fails to tell the bank that the down payment was also borrowed from another source, from somebody else. Enron actually borrowed money to put down equity on these deals and then hid it from view through deceitful accounting. Basically, a new layer of SPVs was created to mimic independent investors, while all the risks were still entirely on Enron, although they were successfully hidden from the eyes of the investors in Enron. And it was all made possible by extensive, deceitful accounting. Let me give a brief account to the electricity trading which Enron entered in during the 90s and kept on with the business in the early 21st century. After establishing itself in gas trading during the 90s, Enron penetrated into this business as well, and in the year 2000, a major energy crisis that hit California came very good and brought a great deal of money to Enron. Unfortunately, we don't have time now to discuss the California crisis, but it is a very, very interesting phenomenon. And if you wish to, we can discuss it another time in more detail. The very crisis in California was due to very badly implemented new regulatory policy of liberalization and deregulation. It wasn't Enron's wrongdoing, exactly speaking. Although Kenneth Lay had wonderful relations with the Bush family, for example, and he was regarded an ambassador at large for the deregulation of the energy industry. However, general advocating for it doesn't mean that California had to put up with such bad rules of the game and with even worse implementation. However, Enron seized the opportunity and led an unprecedented grand-scale market manipulation that brought many millions from their electricity trading activities, while pumping huge amounts of money from Californian electricity consumers' pockets into their own ones. However immoral, the electricity trading did make some real money coming from real business for Enron. Then let me give another brief account for international activities of Enron. The corporation sought to create real money from the foreign markets as well. In particularly, they like to close deals with sometimes problematic governments from the so-called third world nations, enjoying a great support and influence by then United States administrations, by Presidents Clinton and Bush. While United States government's intentions may have been good, as usually they support development of market institutions and infrastructure and regulatory rules in emerging markets to enable fair game to American companies in the future years to come, and to enable American direct investments in those countries. Some of the companies from the United States may have used that to create corruptive deals in still vulnerable democracies or somewhat less democratic states. But unluckily, we don't have time for this either, because this topic is also very broad. The most famous example is fiasco in the Dubravko nuclear power plant in India, which was so economically infeasible that even the World Bank refused to finance it. And note that under the mark-to-market model or mark-to-model rules, such mega projects could have created some wonderful opportunities for making up the numbers in a creative way by Enron's managers. gradually the end of the Enron approached. How the fall began. After exhausting everything there was to exhaust in the energy sector in the United States, to perpetuate the Ponzi scheme, the managers had to diversify in other industries that were going through the deregulation process because there were more opportunities there than in classical industries. In early 2000s, Enron announced investments into a nationwide optical fiber networks. Back then, it didn't necessarily look unreasonable or bad because on the way of the dot-com bubble, many companies invested in fast digital infrastructure. But in time, as it turned out, they overinvested themselves, resulting in very low prices of the digital transmission capacities. Nevertheless, the deal was not going to anywhere, and it certainly didn't create any real money for Enron. So it was a failure. During the spring 2001, public controversies about Enron financial reporting started to grow. For example, James Chanos, a hedge fund manager intimately involved with Enron's deals, identified problems from disclosures on related party transactions involving the firm's senior officers like Andy Fasto, and insider trading occurring in late 2000. In February 2001, that guy, James Chanos, tipped off a reporter at Fortune magazine, Bethany McLean, who subsequently wrote the now famous article, "Is Enron Overpriced?" And there's a lot of going on around that article in the film I suggested you to watch. All of these was an immediate threat of a grand scale disclosure of Enron's wrongdoings. In July 2001, Enron signed a 20-year agreement with Blockbuster Video Corporation to introduce entertainment called video on demand to multiple United States cities by end of that year. Enron would store the entertainment, movies, and encode and stream the content over its future global broadband network. And they actually did some kind of petty pilot projects in Portland, Seattle, and Salt Lake City, where they created services streaming movies to only a few dozen apartments from servers set up in some basement. And based on these petty pilot projects, Enron went ahead and recognized estimated profits under mark-to-model rules of more than $110 million from the Blockbuster deal. Yet, the truth was that neither Blockbuster had not nor could have obtained distribution rights for videos, nor Enron had the technology to implement it. And note well that this was way before Netflix or anything like that. So the technology was not mature yet at the time. Merely a month later, a big debacle took place. Yet Enron did not correct the financial statements. So they broke the contract. Everything went down the stairs, but they didn't correct the financial statements, which only gave more rise to the questions of the truthfulness of Enron's communication of financial state of the company. The Blockbuster deal only increased the problems, but the truth is that the scandal was already unfolding. And now the sequence of events becomes very quick. I have a this timeline here on the slide, so I hope you can read something, at least something of that. For example, on August 14, 2001, Jeffrey Skilling suddenly resigned just 8 months after becoming the CEO of Enron, which is very indicating, and it was a red light that actually stirred up the market for Enron stock, so the exchange market, the Wall Street. In August 2001, the now famous Lay letter was sent by internal employee or manager, accounting manager Sharon Watkins to Ken Lay, where she disclosed the Raptor deals and suggested steps to control the damage in probably the only possible way. So to disclose everything to the public and then gradually try to restructure the debt and so on and so on. What are the Raptor deals? Those are the deals with special purpose entities used for hedging of their risky assets. As I already said, they used to give funny names to those companies they formed. On October 16, 2001, Enron reported $638 million of losses for the third quarter of that year, and declared $1 billion charged to equity due to write-offs of failed water trading, broadband trading, and unwinding of Raptor SPs run by CFO Andrew Fastow, because at that time the fact that they had actually insider trading it became widely known. And as a result, the Enron stocks started to plummet, and this plummeting started to trigger an unbelievable amount of no-loss guarantees provided to the special purpose entities in previous years. On October 22, 2001, Enron acknowledges the Security Exchange Commission inquiry into a possible conflict of interest related to the company's dealings with various off-balance sheet partnerships. The day later, Enron's auditor, Arthur Andersen, destroys literally 1 ton of documents of Enron, which was later discovered, and the consequences for the corporation Arthur Andersen was devastating. And we're talking about the auditing company that had 85,000 of employees around the world. So the Arthur Andersen, in terms of employees, was several times bigger than Enron itself globally. On October 24th, 2001, Ken Lay fires Andrew Fastow, probably hoping that all the guilt will pass to that guy, who was, by the way, very young. He was much younger than the others. On October 31, 2001, the SEC inquiry is upgraded to a formal investigation. On November 8, Enron announces restatement of its final reports for the preceding 5 years to account for additional $586 million in losses. On November 19, Enron restates its third quarter earnings and discloses that it is trying to restructure another $690 million of obligations. And on that day, Enron stock plunges below $1 from $90 that was the value like 2 months ago or 3 months ago. On December 2nd, 2001, Enron files for bankruptcy protection. And on January 9, 2002, United States Justice Department confirms it has begun a criminal investigation of Enron. So that was the end. As of mid-2001, the stock started to plunge, and this plunge was so unbelievable and so unseen before that it was staggering for the whole business community, for the whole world. And the Enron case became very famous and known everywhere in the world, and there's probably not a single person living on Earth at that time watching the news who didn't hear about this event. And just to mention, while everything happens, Enron executives cashed in through time about a total of $1.3 billion of their stock options. I'm talking about like 10 people who cashed in 1.3 billion. At the same time, the results of their wrongdoings can be briefly summarized in these few statements. Tens of thousands, including 21,000 of Enron's own workers, were left without pensions because 32 pension funds involved with Enron's special purpose vehicles went bankrupt. And the total damages here account for approximately $2 billion American dollars. And mind you, these are $2 billion from the year 2001. So today it would probably be like $4 or $5 billion. Then tens of thousands of people were left without jobs. 60 billion American dollars of investors' money has gone. Billions of dollars overpaid by California's electricity consumers, and many businesses there in California were bankrupt during the California electricity crisis, which was largely, so to say, influenced by Enron. And of course, many people in the third world countries suffered. Croatia also had a deal with Enron in the late 90s when they made a contract with Croatian government to build another gas-fired plant in Jertovec in Zagorje County. But it never happened because after the crash of Enron, the then new government of the Republic of Croatia broke the deal, and they choose to pay the damages for breaking the deal instead of making it happen, because they assessed that the long-term damages would far exceed the cost of the early termination of that contract. So what were the reasons for such behavior of those people who are not stupid or non-educated? Or Ken Lay was a doctor of economic sciences. Skilling and Festo were Harvard boys. They were very educated and very capable men. So what in the world happened in their minds to do that? I imagine what could have happened. At first, but of course, you don't have to agree with me. At first, there could be just a simple greed. Let's make some money for ourselves. Okay, we have these stock options as senior managers. If we wait for the organic growth of the company based on real business, it will take a long time for us to make serious money. And the life is short, you know. So why not speed it up a bit? Can we use some kind of legally allowable accounting system to make our financial position look increasingly better in time so that our stocks go up? Okay, we try this Mark II model or Mark to market accounting. We try our SPVs and every single scheme that we did, and it worked. And it still works. Yet to keep the stocks rising, we need more. All the time, we need more. More surprises, more good news for the market. But we also need to close all loans given to our SPVs. So let's make new SPVs to get more loans to repay those older ones. And okay, well, it still works. But after a while, we realized, aren't we too deep in that? Because we seemingly cannot go out anymore. I mean, how to get out of multi-billion dollars of debts which are not put into development of real business that will bring us money. That's the whole trouble all the time. As I mentioned when I was talking about the basic accounting principles, the only things that really matters in business is money coming from real business. All those financial operations are not essentially important because you only have to give back the money which you lend from a bank or somebody. So it seems that we must keep dancing until we drop dead, or what? And what can we do now? And the answer is nothing really. After revelation, the main actors, those three guys and a number of others, ended up in jail, except Ken Lay, who died of a heart attack during the process of trial. The one with the longest sentence, Jeff Skilling, was released last year after about 12 years spent in federal prison. And there are some news in the media that he is to start new trading businesses with another, a very clever, I must say, Enron's senior manager called Lu Pai, who was a Chinese guy who was the only smart enough to cash in his stock options 2 years before everything went apart. And he just moved to Hawaii and had a fruitful and healthy and wealthy life. And nobody could touch him because he just, escaped in time. So was it worth to spend 12 years in jail for, I don't know, 100 or 200 million of dollars of net income? I know you can have different positions on that. But then what about the banks? The bank managers are anything but stupid, right? They knew everything all the time. Or did they in the beginning? At first, the businesses like Jedi could have looked and even been normal and legitimate. Enron did use services of many banks, so they diversified the banks as sources of money, of liquidity. However, when the vast volume of the problem was discovered publicly, the banks may have suddenly realized that they were exposed individually, much more than they anticipated earlier. So could it be that they were, in a way, forced to keep protecting Enron as long as they could have, because it became too big to be allowed to fail? Next, the question of the auditors. There's no need to say much more here. As once Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet, I guess, who will guard the guardians? So the auditors are the guardians of the systems. They need to be trusted. And it was absolutely impossible without a cooperation of, in this case, Arthur Andersen Company. which, as I already said, was driven out of business by the court and by the customers. No one simply wanted to deal with them anymore because SEC would not accept their audits anymore. Although the Supreme Court of the United States reversed the judgment only about 4 years later, until that time, the customers found another auditors and didn't want to make any business with Arthur Andersen. So it was finished. And it was restructured, and the vast number of specialists, of professionals, went to another consultancy or auditing companies. But Arthur Andersen was doomed. What about the state? Was the state, I mean the United States in this case, or were the states captured? And what is the state capture? How in world schemes like this could have perpetuated for years not to be noticed by anyone? Who and why made such bad rules of the game and left so many loopholes in the California electricity deregulation package of regulatory rules? How was it possible at all? Then was the, for example, public socializing between American presidents and Enron executives, subtle subliminal messaging to everybody around, including the government's institutions, about how to behave with that company? In the third world countries, was it really necessary for those governments to enter into unfair deals at the expense of already very poor citizens? Okay, so I'm open for your questions. Please, the floor is all yours. Okay. If there are no questions, thank you everyone for being so nice to come here and watch the presentation, and until the next time, bye-bye.